Imagine taking a country, any country, and handing them the ultimate economic lottery ticket.
Right, like a massive windfall.
Exactly. We're talking about billions of dollars in new wealth just washing over the national borders in like a matter of a few years.
Yeah.
And with that windfall, they build these gleaming new skyscrapers. They practically wipe out child mortality. And they hit this 99% literacy rate.
Which is incredible. I mean, it sounds like a utopian success story.
It totally does, right.
Yeah.
But underneath that shiny modern surface, there's this terrifying economic clock ticking.
Yep.
Because the very resource that paid for all those hospitals and schools is, well, it's the exact same resource the rest of the world is desperately trying to phase out.
And that's the core tension. It's a phenomenal case study in the friction of rapid modernization.
Right.
Because when you look at the raw data of a nation undergoing that kind of hypergrowth, it forces you to ask a really difficult question. Are they building a sustainable economic engine or
are they just riding a wave?
Exactly. Are they just riding this massive temporary wave of resource wealth that's eventually going to crash?
And that is exactly what we are unpacking with you today on this deep dive. Because we got our hands on this really massive, comprehensive data set.
What is dense?
Super dense. It's this 30-year retrospective report, and the title is, let me read it, Azerbaijan's Socioeconomic Transition and Sustainable Development Report, 1990 to 2022.
Yeah, and just looking at the presentation itself, it sets a very specific tone right off the bat.
Oh, totally. The cover slide is just this pure white background, super minimalist, left-aligned text.
Right.
And on the right, there's this really stark geometric line graph made of these gray and dark blue lines. It's very academic, very rigorous.
Which tells you we aren't just looking at, political talking points. We're looking at hard, macro-level data. And our mission here is to translate those cold geometric lines into the real human stories they represent.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How do you take an economy out of the chaotic collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s and turn it into a modern, urbanized state?
Well, to really grasp the scale of what happened here, you have to rewind to that starting line.
The 1990s.
Right. Because when the Soviet Union dissolved, the economic shockwaves were they were catastrophic.
I can imagine.
You had shattered supply chains, hyperinflation, factories that suddenly had no buyers for their parts. So the baseline we're starting from on slide 2 is a period of severe economic contraction.
Which makes the trajectory from that point onward almost hard to process. Let's talk about the numbers, because the sheer scale of the wealth generation on slide 3 is staggering.
It really is an exponential leap.
Yeah, they use this dual-axis line chart. And if you track their gross domestic product, and the data here uses constant 2015 U.S. dollars to, strip away the illusion of inflation.
Right, to show real value.
Exactly. You see an economy that was hovering around the $20 billion mark in the 90s, and then it just rockets upward.
Yeah.
Recently stabilizing at over $40 billion. They literally doubled the tangible volume of goods and services produced.
Which is a monumental feat over a couple of decades. But, GDP is just the macroscopic view.
Right.
If you want to understand what that actually felt like on the streets of Baku, the capital, we have to look at the other line on that chart, the gross national income per capita.
The GNI.
Exactly. And specifically, the one adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Okay, let's break that down for someone listening who might not, live and breed macroeconomic indicators.
Yeah.
Why do we care about purchasing power parity? Why not just look at the raw dollar amount?
Because a raw dollar amount is essentially useless without context.
How so?
Well, if I tell you the average income in a country is, say, $10,000 a year, your immediate reaction is probably, oh, that's extreme poverty.
Right, because I couldn't pay rent with that.
Exactly, because you're applying your own cost of living to that $10,000.
Mm-hmm.
But PPP adjusts the income based on a localized basket of goods.
Oh, I see.
It asks how many loaves of bread, how many months of rent, how many bus tickets does that money actually buy in that specific country.
So it measures the actual standard of living. It measures real purchasing power.
Spot on.
Yeah.
And when you look at the PPP adjusted income for Azerbaijan over this 30-year period, it isn't just a steady climb. It's a massive leapfrogging increase.
Wow.
The average citizen's actual ability to buy things, to secure housing, to feed their family, it objectively skyrocketed.
But there is a very specific window on this chart where the growth essentially goes vertical.
Yes. The researchers actually circle it with a dark blue dotted line.
Right, the mid-2000s, the era of hypergrowth. And they attribute this explicitly to energy exports. Now, I want to push back on this a little bit.
Okay, go ahead.
Because a country doesn't just wake up one morning in 2005, realize they have oil, and instantly double their GDP. I mean, what is the actual mechanism that causes a national economy to explode that rapidly?
That's a great point, and you're absolutely right. The oil didn't just magically appear. Azerbaijan has been extracting oil since, I think, the 19th century.
Right, they've always had it.
So the mechanism of this specific hypergrowth era wasn't discovery. It was infrastructure and global market access.
I'm interested.
Yeah, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a massive influx of foreign capital to build pipelines.
Because they're landlocked, right, on the Caspian Sea.
Exactly. They needed a way to get the oil and natural gas out of the Caspian and into the Mediterranean, where it could be sold to the world.
So it's the sudden capacity to export it at an unprecedented volume.
Yes. I mean, you spend years and literally billions of dollars laying thousands of miles of steel pipe. It's a massive capital sink.
Yeah.
But the moment that pipeline goes live and the oil starts flowing to international markets, the revenue switch just flips.
Boom.
Boom. Suddenly, you have billions of petrodollars washing into the state treasury every single month. When your export volume quadruples and global oil prices are favorable, your GDP just erupts.
It's like turning on a fire hose of capital inside a relatively small economy. And, I mean, that money has to go somewhere, right?
It does.
Which brings us to the demographic shift on slide 5, because you can't pump billions of dollars into a country without physically altering where and how the people live.
No, the geography changes entirely.
Yeah, the data here shows a total population climbing from roughly 4 million to officially breaking the 10 million mark. They even put a little red circle on the chart right where it crosses 10 million.
It's a huge milestone.
But the urbanization data is what really stands out to me. The capital city, Baku, became this massive gravitational center, swelling to over 2 million residents.
It absorbed a gigantic percentage of the country's total urban population. It's what economists call extreme agglomeration.
Right. So here is my question for you. When we see a city like Baku double or triple in size during an oil boom, is this purely an oil rush?
What do you mean?
Like, are we just seeing a modern-day California gold rush where everyone moves to the capital because that's where the oil companies are? Or is this just a natural modernization process, people leaving farms for the city that got put on fast forward?
Well, it's primarily an oil-driven phenomenon, but it operates through a mechanism called the multiplier effect.
Okay, explain that.
The reality of the energy sector is that it doesn't actually employ that many people. You don't need 1 million workers to run an oil rig.
Right, you just need some engineers.
Exactly. A few highly trained engineers and technicians. So the rural population isn't moving to Baku to drill for oil.
Then what are they moving there for?
They're moving there to capture the secondary wave of wealth.
Ah.
When the state treasury fills up with oil money, the government starts spending. They build new ministries, new highways, these gleaming architectural landmarks.
And someone has to build all that.
Right. That creates an immediate massive demand for construction workers. And then those construction workers, plus the newly wealthy government bureaucrats, they all need places to eat.
Places to shop.
People to drive them around.
Yeah.
Which creates a massive demand for service sector workers.
So it's not the oil jobs, it's the wealth of the energy sector creating this localized, hyperactive boom economy within the city limits.
Precisely. The wage gap between a rural agricultural village and the capital city becomes enormous almost overnight.
So if you're a young person in a rural area in the early 2000s, the logical economic choice is to move to Baku.
Absolutely. But the friction comes from the velocity of that movement.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
When a single city absorbs millions of people in such a compressed time frame, the physical infrastructure, the housing, the transit, the sewage systems, it struggles under immense pressure.
It's like winning the economic lottery, but having to build the mansion while you're already living in it.
That is a perfect analogy.
Which actually makes the next part of this data so fascinating. Because historically, when developing nations experience a sudden, massive resource boom, it often ends in tragedy, doesn't it?
Oh, the resource curse, yes.
The money gets siphoned off by corruption, it disappears into foreign bank accounts, or it's wasted on vanity projects, while the newly crowded cities collapse into slums.
It's a very common pattern.
But the data here shows that they actually manage the human side of this transition remarkably well. If we're grading their 30-year report card, Their human capital development is where they score the absolute highest.
I would argue it's their greatest triumph, the translation of raw energy wealth into tangible human development.
So let's dig into the education numbers on slide 6,
Right.
because they are staggering. The adult literacy rate for anyone aged 15 and over is sitting at approximately 99.9%.
Nearly universal.
And the presentation explicitly notes that they have achieved complete gender parity. The slide has this bold 99.9% with a little equal sign next to it to emphasize that the gap in basic education between men and women has been effectively erased.
Which is huge. Primary school completion is practically universal for both boys and girls.
Now, I have to be a little skeptical here.
Okay.
99% literacy across an entire nation, including remote mountainous regions, in a country that started its transition in the economic chaos of a post-Soviet collapse. I mean, how is that logistically possible?
It's a valid skepticism for sure, but it's really important to understand the inheritance of this state.
What do you mean?
Well, one of the few positive legacies of the Soviet era was a deeply ingrained, standardized system of compulsory public education.
Oh, right.
So when the Soviet Union collapsed, obviously that system frayed. Teachers weren't getting paid, schools fell into disrepair, but the cultural expectation of universal education remained.
So the blueprint was already there. They just needed the funding to turn the lights back on.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where the oil money was highly effective. They didn't have to invent the concept of a national school system from scratch.
They just funded it.
Yeah, they used the resource revenues to rebuild the physical schools, update the curriculum, and crucially, pay teachers a stable wage.
Makes sense.
When you have state capacity funded by billions in energy exports, you can enforce compulsory education even in the most remote villages. You can ensure every single girl completes primary school.
That is a massive logistical victory. But, education is a long game. You fund a primary school today, and you don't see the economic return on that student for, 15 or 20 years?
At least, yeah.
Healthcare, on the other hand, shows up in the vital statistics almost immediately. And the healthcare data on slide 7 tells a really profound story of human welfare.
It really does. What's fascinating here is the life expectancy trend.
Yeah, the chart shows life expectancy, particularly for women, steadily climbing from the 50s up to about 76 years.
A gain of more than 2 decades of life for the average citizen.
Wow. And even more striking is the under 5 child mortality rate. The slide uses a scatter plot with a trend line, and it shows what the researchers call a cliff drop.
A steep, massive, long-term decline.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. This isn't just an abstract economic indicator.
No, not at all.
This is thousands of families keeping their children. This is nurseries staying full. When you talk about the return on investment for the oil boom, to me, this is the ultimate metric.
I would agree completely. It's the definitive metric of state capacity. Because achieving a cliff drop in child mortality is incredibly difficult.
Why is it harder than, say, building a hospital?
Because you cannot solve infant mortality by building one state-of-the-art multi-billion-dollar hospital in the center of the capital.
Right, because the people dying in rural areas aren't the ones who can access the elite hospital anyway.
Exactly. Moving the national needle on child mortality requires systemic, unglamorous public health infrastructure.
Unglamorous?
It requires a cold chain logistics network that can deliver stable, refrigerated vaccines to every single rural clinic. It requires training thousands of midwives, accessible prenatal care.
Wow.
And crucially, it loops right back to that 99% literacy rate we just discussed.
Wait, really? How does literacy connect to child mortality?
Oh, deeply. Decades of global development data show that the single greatest predictor of a child's survival is the education level of the mother.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. An educated mother understands nutrition. She can read dosage instructions on medication. She knows when a fever requires a doctor versus when it can be managed at home.
So the literacy rate and the child mortality rate are intrinsically linked.
Completely intertwined.
But there is one more piece to the public health puzzle on slide 9, and it's probably the least glamorous of all: plumbing.
Yes. The literal pipes.
The infographic here uses these little water drop and shield icons, and it highlights a massive leap in access to basic, safe drinking water. And they specifically point out that the historical gap between urban and rural water access was drastically narrowed.
Which is key.
Yeah.
They didn't just build water treatment plants for the elites in Baku, they ran pipes out to the countryside.
And safely managed sanitation in the cities maintained very high coverage, too.
Public health officials have a saying: a PVC pipe and a functioning sewer system will save more lives than a team of Harvard-trained
I
surgeons.
love that.
It's true. Separating drinking water from wastewater is the absolute foundation of human progress. Waterborne diseases like cholera or dysentery, those are the primary drivers of historical child mortality.
So by utilizing their resource revenues to build out this physical water infrastructure universally, they effectively eliminated the root causes of those early deaths.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's take a breath and synthesize this first half of the national transition. We're looking at a population of roughly 10 million people. They are highly urbanized, they are almost universally literate, they are living 2 decades longer than the previous generation, and their children are surviving infancy at historic rates.
They have clean water, modern cities.
Right. By any traditional metric, this is a phenomenal developmental foundation.
It is a profound achievement. But, a foundation is just the concrete poured into the ground.
True.
It doesn't tell you if the house built on top of it is structurally sound.
And this is where the story pivots, because you have 10 million healthy, educated people living mostly in cities. They wake up on a Tuesday morning, they drop their kids off at the fully funded primary school, and then where do they go?
Right, what do they do?
What do all these people actually do for work?
And this is exactly where the systemic vulnerabilities begin to reveal themselves. When we look at the structure of the economy versus the structure of the labor market, we see a massive, dangerous disconnect.
Let's dive into that disconnect. On slide 4, they break down the national GDP into 3 main pillars: agriculture, industry, which crucially includes the energy sector, and construction and services.
Right, the classic 3 sectors.
And the visual narrative of this area chart is stark. The total economic value generated by agriculture has been squeezed into this tiny, almost irrelevant sliver of the national wealth. Meanwhile, industry and modern services have expanded to become the twin engines of the GDP.
So from a pure wealth generation standpoint, agriculture has been entirely marginalized.
The money is coming from the oil rigs and the modern service economy.
Exactly, but then you look at the labor market data on slide 8, where the people actually work, and the reality flips upside down.
Yeah, this donut chart is wild.
It is, because agriculture, despite producing almost none of the national wealth, still holds on to a remarkably large chunk of the workforce.
So you have a huge segment of the population working in a sector that generates basically pennies on the dollar.
Which is the textbook definition of low labor productivity. If a sector isn't generating financial value, it cannot pay high wages.
Right.
So the workers trapped in that agricultural segment are going to remain structurally poor, regardless of how high the national GDP climbs.
So why don't they just leave agriculture and get jobs in the industry sector? I mean, after all, industry is generating the lion's share of the national wealth.
You'd think so.
But the employment data shows that industry's share of the workforce is actually quite small, and it's heavily male-dominated. Why isn't the sector that makes all the money hiring all the people?
Because of the fundamental nature of fossil fuel extraction.
Okay.
The energy sector is what economists call highly capital intensive. It is not labor intensive.
Explain the difference.
Well, think about the mechanics of drilling for offshore oil. You need to spend $5 billion to build a deep water platform, lay subsea pipelines, and construct a high-tech refinery.
That's massive capital.
Right. But once that infrastructure is built, how many people does it take to press the buttons and monitor the pressure gauges?
A few hundred. Maybe a few thousand highly specialized technicians.
Exactly. It requires a very small, highly educated, specialized workforce. It does not require millions of general laborers.
Ah,
I see you cannot absorb an expanding, newly urbanized population of 10 million people into the control rooms of an oil refinery. The sector that generates the most wealth is inherently incapable of creating mass employment.
Which leaves us with the third pillar, the service sector. The donut chart here actually has the services slices slightly pulled out, an exploded slice to highlight it.
Yep.
It shows that services have become the ultimate employment reservoir for the country. It has absorbed nearly 50% of the total national labor force. Almost half the country works in services.
Half the workforce.
Now, as someone looking at this economy, is that a sign of success? Because when I hear service sector, I think of 2 completely different realities.
Oh, absolutely.
On one hand, you have high-end software engineering, international finance, global consulting. On the other hand, you have pouring coffee, driving taxis, and folding clothes in a retail store. Which service sector are we looking at here?
And that distinction is the most critical vulnerability in this entire report.
Okay, lay it on me.
In a robust, diversified economy, a large service sector is a sign of advanced development because those services are exportable.
Exportable services, like what?
Think of India exporting IT and customer support services to the world, or the United Kingdom exporting complex financial and legal services.
They're selling their brainpower to the rest of the world.
Exactly. They're creating independent value and drawing foreign capital into their country.
Okay.
But in a resource-dependent economy, the service sector usually looks very different. It is almost entirely non-tradable domestic consumption.
So retail, hospitality, transportation.
Restaurants, basic administration, yes. They aren't exporting these services, they are only selling them to each other.
And who is funding all this domestic consumption?
Ultimately, the wealth generated by the energy sector. Let's trace the life cycle of a dollar in this economy.
Let's do it.
The state-owned energy company sells a barrel of oil to Europe. That petrodollar goes into the government treasury.
Okay, step one.
Step 2. The government uses that dollar to pay a civil servant's salary or to hire a domestic construction firm to build a new road.
Right.
Step 3. That civil servant or construction worker takes that dollar and uses it to buy a cup of coffee, take a taxi, or buy a new shirt.
So the barista, the taxi driver, and the retail worker are all indirectly being paid by the barrel of oil.
Precisely.
Uh,
The vast majority of the service sector isn't creating new wealth. It is simply recycling the energy wealth around the domestic economy.
wow.
It's a derivative sector. It is feeding off the oil revenue.
That is a terrifying structural flaw, because if the price of oil crashes on the global market, the entire chain breaks.
It snaps immediately.
The government budget shrinks, they stop building roads, they freeze civil servant salaries, and suddenly the construction worker and the bureaucrat stop taking taxis and stop buying coffee.
The coffee shop goes bankrupt, and the service sector collapses because it had no independent source of revenue to begin with.
It's an incredibly fragile ecosystem, but, the report does highlight one area on slide 13 where they have laid the groundwork to potentially escape this drought.
Ah, the digital infrastructure. Yes.
Right, the internet penetration data. This stepladder chart is pretty impressive. Over the last decade, there has been an explosive leapfrog development in connectivity.
A massive jump.
Internet penetration jumped from less than 10% to over 80% in a shockingly short time frame. Currently, male internet usage is over 90%, and female usage is closely tracking right behind it.
And fixed broadband subscriptions have skyrocketed too.
So what does that mean for them?
It means they have built the literal fiber optic foundation required for a modern digital economy.
Yeah.
You cannot build a high-value exportable tech sector without universal broadband.
Right.
They've successfully connected their highly literate population to the global grid.
Okay, so they have the fiber optics, they have the smart, educated young people, they have the capital from the oil boom.
Yep.
They have everything they need to transition from pouring coffee to coding software. Are they doing it? Are they building the next wave of global tech companies?
And this brings us to the darkest part of the data set, the structural flaws that threaten everything they've built.
Uh-oh.
If the first half of this analysis was a celebration of human development, this section is a blaring 5-alarm fire.
Let's talk about the core vulnerabilities then, starting with what the researchers call the energy trap on slide 10.
The waffle chart.
Yes, the waffle chart. For those listening, imagine a grid of 100 little squares representing the nation's total energy consumption. 98 of those squares are dark gray representing fossil fuels.
Almost the entire grid.
And then there's this tiny little sliver, less than 2 squares, colored light blue, representing renewable sources like solar or wind. They are essentially 100% dependent on fossil fuels for their own survival.
For a country that has been actively modernizing and investing heavily in infrastructure for 30 years, to have less than 2% of your power generated by renewables is a massive strategic failure.
But why? I mean, they have the money. They have vast sun-drenched plains and windswept coastlines along the Caspian Sea. Why wouldn't they just build massive solar farms?
Because of the perverse economic incentives of being a petrostate.
Meaning what?
When you sit on massive, easily accessible reserves of natural gas, your domestic energy is practically free. The government heavily subsidizes the cost of power for its citizens and businesses.
Oh, I see.
When you can burn your own gas for pennies, the immediate short-term economic incentive to spend billions of dollars importing solar panels and wind turbines is absolutely zero. It feels like an unnecessary expense.
But it's an expense they have to make because the world outside their borders is changing rapidly. And the environmental cost of this fossil-fueled industrialization is compounding.
Right. Look at slide 11.
Yeah, the climate footprint data. Total CO2 emissions are stubbornly high, and per capita emissions are hovering between 4 and 6 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The researchers even put a little crosshair icon on the peak year to emphasize the problem.
That is the direct, unavoidable environmental cost of powering a modernizing economy entirely with fossil fuels. But the threat here isn't just environmental. It is an existential economic threat.
Because their primary customer base is trying to go green.
Exactly. The global market is actively attempting to aggressively phase out fossil fuels. The European Union, which is a massive export destination for them, is currently implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It's essentially a tax on carbon-intensive imports.
Ah.
If you try to sell a product into the European market, and that product was manufactured using a dirty carbon-heavy power grid.
Europe is going to slap a heavy tariff on it.
Exactly, to level the playing field with their own green industries.
So not only is the world trying to stop buying their primary export, oil and gas, but the world is also going to penalize them for using that oil and gas to power their own domestic industries.
It's a double hit.
It feels like they are running on a treadmill powered by oil. The faster the rest of the world moves toward green energy and carbon taxes, the faster they have to run on this oil treadmill just to stay in place financially.
That is exactly what's happening.
And if the treadmill breaks, or if the global market simply unplugs it by transitioning to renewables, they have absolutely nothing to fall back on.
That treadmill analogy is perfect, because the only way to get off that treadmill is to invent a new machine. You need to create new, non-extractive value.
You need innovation.
Need innovation. And that brings us to the single most alarming data point in the entire 30-year report. Slide 12.
The innovation deficit. The report tracks the nation's expenditure on research and development R&D as a percentage of their total GDP. And this bar chart, the bars are barely visible.
And microscopic.
They are flatlining at roughly 0.2% of their GDP. The researchers literally drew a warning line across the data, flagging this as critically below the global average for innovation investment.
And the downstream effects of that 0.2% are obvious in the rest of the data.
Like what?
The number of active scientific researchers per million people is incredibly low. The volume of scientific journal publications, or registered patents, is basically a blip on the global radar.
Yeah.
They simply do not have a scientific ecosystem.
I want to push you on this 0.2% figure, because to an average person, 0.2% of a $40 billion economy still sounds like a decent chunk of money, millions of dollars. Why is this a 5-alarm fire level? What is the global average they should be hitting if they want to build a tech sector and get off the oil treadmill?
To be globally competitive, an emerging economy that wants to transition into high-value technology and services should be targeting an R&D spend of at least 1.5 to 2% of their GDP.
Wow, okay.
If you look at advanced, highly innovative economies, places like South Korea, Israel, or the Nordic countries, they are pushing 3, 4, even 5% of their GDP into research and development.
So they aren't just a little bit behind. They are off by a factor of 10 or 20.
At least. You cannot sustain a modern diversified economy with a 0.2% R&D spend. When you spend that little, you are explicitly choosing to be a consumer of technology, never a creator.
Explain what that looks like on the ground.
It means you have to buy your smartphones from China or the US. You have to buy your advanced drilling software from Norway. You buy your medical imaging devices from Germany.
Because you aren't making them yourself.
Right. You are paying a premium to import the intellectual property of other nations, but you are creating no intellectual property of your own to sell back to them. You are not inventing the next generation of solar panels. You aren't developing proprietary agricultural tech. You aren't writing globally adopted software.
You are just paying rent on other people's ideas.
Exactly. And if your service sector is just domestic retail recycling petrodollars, and you have no intellectual property to export and global demand for your oil slowly declines,
you fall straight into the abyss.
Economists call this the middle income trap.
Yeah.
You get stuck. You are too wealthy, and your labor is too expensive to compete with low-wage manufacturing countries, but you are too poor in innovation and talent to compete with the high-tech, advanced economies. You just stagnate.
So the diagnosis is glaringly obvious. The foundation is cracking. If the problems are this clear, they need to build massive solar farms to break the fossil fuel reliance, and they need to hike their R&D spending from 0.2% to 2%. Why hasn't it happened yet?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Right. They have the capital from the oil boom, they have the sovereign wealth fund, they have 10 million educated citizens. If the government knows they're on a ticking clock, why don't they just write a massive check tomorrow to build a Silicon Valley-style tech hub and 1,000 wind turbines?
Because writing a check is the easy part. Throwing money at a problem does not create innovation.
It doesn't.
No. Executing complex, multi-decade economic transitions requires an incredibly sophisticated, highly functional, invisible architecture.
An invisible architecture.
Yes, it requires institutions. And that leads us to the final and perhaps most difficult part of our deep dive on slide 14, institutional bottlenecks.
Let's talk about the software of the state, because the report includes data on global governance indicators, measuring things like regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption.
And the numbers here are grim.
Very grim. They use this parallel coordinates plot to show rankings. And their percentile ranking for control of corruption is stuck in the bottom tier globally, fluctuating in the single digits up to maybe 20%. They are in the bottom fifth of all countries.
Right.
And the report explicitly flags this lack of regulatory quality and rule of law as the core bottleneck preventing them from attracting foreign investment. They circled it right there on the slide.
And this is the exact reason why they can't just write a check to build a new economy. Because you cannot build a modern tech sector or a green energy grid in isolation.
What do you need?
You need foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Yeah.
You need global tech firms to open offices in your capital. You need international green energy consortiums to bring their expertise and capital to build your wind farms.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
Why does corruption or a weak legal system stop a wind farm, but it doesn't stop an oil rig? International oil companies operate in some of the most corrupt, institutionally weak environments on the planet all the time.
They absolutely do.
They still show up, they still drill, and they still make billions. Why is it a complete bottleneck for green energy or tech?
It all comes down to the mechanics of risk and time horizons.
Okay.
The economics of fossil fuel extraction are entirely unique. The profit margins on oil are so massive, and the timeline to profitability can be so fast that oil companies have an incredibly high tolerance for risk.
They just price it in.
Exactly. They factor the corruption into their financial models. They get in, extract the resource, and get their capital out. The sheer volume of wealth outweighs the institutional risk.
But the economics of a wind farm are different.
Entirely different. A wind farm is a utility. The profit margins are relatively thin, and it takes 20 to 30 years of selling electricity at a steady rate to generate a return on that massive initial investment.
Right. And for tech?
Similarly, if you are a foreign tech company opening an R&D lab, it might take a decade before a single line of code turns into a profitable product.
So they need long-term stability.
They need absolute certainty. If you are going to sink $1 billion into a wind farm that takes 25 years to pay off, you need an ironclad guarantee that the contract you sign today will be honored by the local courts a quarter of a century from now.
Which makes sense.
You need to know that a corrupt local official cannot arbitrarily change the tax regulations on a whim to squeeze you for bribes. You need to know that if a domestic competitor steals your intellectual property, the judicial system will actually protect your patent.
So if that rule of law doesn't exist?
If the courts are weak and the regulatory environment is opaque, the risk destroys the financial model.
Yeah.
The foreign green energy firm or the international tech giant looks at the environment, realizes their assets could be seized or their IP stolen, and they simply take their billions of dollars and invest them in a country with stronger institutions.
It's a brilliant point. The institutions must evolve to match the shiny new infrastructure. It doesn't matter how fast your broadband fiber optics are if a foreign tech company doesn't trust your legal system to protect its code.
Exactly. You can't run a 21st century innovation economy on 20th century extractive institutions. The software of the state must be upgraded to run the new hardware they've built.
Which brings us to the final verdict of this 30-year report on slide 15. The researchers lay out 3 main policy directives for the future. It's essentially the roadmap for the next 3 decades, the path from resource-driven growth to sustainable diversification.
Right. Directive 1 is to consolidate the historic gains in social capital.
Right, the education and health.
Yes, they achieved incredible, genuinely historic things with education, lifespan, and public health. They cannot let those slip backward. They need to protect that human foundation.
Directive 2 is the green transition. They must urgently break that near 100% reliance on fossil fuels. They need massive, immediate investments in renewable energy to lower their carbon footprint and align themselves with a global market that is actively penalizing carbon emissions.
And Directive 3, the hardest one of all, innovation and governance.
The software upgrade.
Right. They have to drastically hike that R&D spending away from the 0.2% flat line, while simultaneously overhauling the regulatory and rule of law environment. Because without good governance and transparent courts, you cannot unlock the vitality of the private sector. And without a vibrant, competitive private sector, you simply cannot innovate.
Synthesizing this whole journey, it is truly a story of two mountains.
Two mountains.
Yeah. Looking back at everything we've unpacked today, it's clear they started in the deep valley of a post-Soviet collapse. It was a bleak, difficult starting point. But they strapped themselves to the rocket ship of oil and gas wealth, and they shot to the top of the first mountain at breakneck speed.
That's a good way to put it.
They generated incredible national wealth. They built schools so every child can read. They laid water pipes so infants survive. They built a massive, hyper-connected capital city. By any measure, climbing that first mountain was a historic success.
But now they are standing at the summit of that first mountain, looking out at the global landscape, and they realize it's an isolated peak.
Right. The oil mountain doesn't connect to the future. To keep growing, to survive in a post-carbon world, they have to climb the second mountain, the mountain of a diversified, innovative, green economy.
And they can't jump.
No. And here's the tragic catch. You cannot use the oil rocket ship to climb the second mountain. The rocket ship is out of fuel, or at least the world is banning the fuel. They have to climb the second mountain step by step through the hard, unglamorous work of institutional reform, scientific research, and establishing the rule of law.
And that requires a fundamentally different set of tools and a completely different national mindset.
How so?
Well, the skills and the centralized power structures that allow a state to efficiently drill for oil and build highways are vastly different from the delicate, decentralized skills required to foster an ecosystem of tech startups, independent courts, and renewable energy grids.
Which is such a profound lesson. And it reminds you that this deep dive isn't just about one specific country in the Caucasus Mountains. It's a masterclass in how human economies grow, how they adapt, and how they eventually stall out. Whether you are leading a small tech startup, managing a massive legacy corporation, or studying global economic markets, the lesson scales perfectly. The skills, the resources, and the strategies that get you to your first major success are almost rarely the ones that keep you there.
What got you to $10 million won't get you to $100 million.
Exactly. And what got a nation out of Soviet collapse and into middle-income wealth will absolutely not get it to advanced economy status.
You have to be willing to systematically dismantle and disrupt your own successful business model before the global market does it for you by force.
Perfectly said. And that leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to explore on your own.
Yeah.
Think about the massive psychological weight of everything we've discussed today. What happens to the collective psychology of a nation, the pride, the identity, the politics, when the natural resource that literally built the foundation of their modern lives becomes a global liability?
That's a heavy question.
Right. I mean, the very oil that paid for the teachers, so 99% of the country could read, the very oil that bought the vaccines and laid the pipes that stopped the infant mortality crisis. What happens when that exact resource becomes the villain of the global economy? Can a society successfully re-engineer its entire economic DNA, rewrite its laws, and reinvent its workforce, all while the engine is still running?
It is going to be a fascinating and very precarious transition to watch over the next decade.
Keep an eye on the data, watch how those institutions evolve, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.